the 1970s was the idea of an extra length race that was a non-conventional race that was not necessarily a speed event but an endurance race. In fact, after the World Championship got started, there was a concept called an enduro at other American racetracks where you basically got the least expensive car you could and ran it into the ground as much as you could for action, not necessarily a speed.
A lot of racetracks picked up on what they called the endurance race, where it would be a long race, more of a crash fest than what the high-speed, high-horsepower racing is at the Indianapolis Speedrome. The other thing John did, we took the figure eight racing on tour for 3 years under sponsorship of General Tire, and that had a huge impact because it brought some of the figure eight cars at the racetracks we went to, especially down in Florida and here throughout the Midwest, got some of their local drivers involved with our drivers as far as, racing on their home track. Again, we sold the sizzle. We were the high horsepower guys from Indianapolis coming down to race at your track in this thrilling figure eight. And one entity that I need to explain, especially to the Historical Society, figure eight racing, people think of it as the county fair, close quarters figure eight that is kind of a demolition derby in disguise. The Indianapolis Speedrome figure eight was always a high caliber race car that had high horsepower, high entertainment value. The entire infield at the Speedrome is paved so that as the cars come off the corner, you have this exciting weaving in and out throughout the long stretch, not just a crossover. And drivers were really, really skilled and very intricate in their timing, as you would see another car come off another corner. And some of the best stock car drivers were right here in our own backyard. If you could do the figure eight, you were able to do anything.
Now, there are people that call figure eight racing a controlled crash, and there is an element to that, but it's also what the people call a serious race as well. Maybe you could explain or understand that nuance.
It's very serious at the Indianapolis Speedrome because the 3 hour figure eight, the endurance race, was a high dollar, high purse event, paying anywhere from in the early days $3,000, which Jim Fox won, to $5,000, eventually up to $20,000 to win, which is an enormous sum, and it took an enormous amount of dollars to put that event on. But John was very, very innovative, very, very concerned with a level playing field. He wanted to make sure that the guy who spent average amount of dollars on his race car, whether it would be the late model or the stock class type car, that he could come in and compete and get a fair shake. It wasn't just always chasing the hot guys that would be up front with maybe the better equipment. He took very, very concise strides through the rules and through the elements of competition to have a fair field for competition.
For that World Championship, Stiles took and violated and discarded one of the most honored rules of racing, that the number of cars decreases as the event goes on.
This event was one that the number of cars increased as the event went on. We would have anywhere from 50 to 70 cars, over 70 cars. Every car that qualified had a chance to race. He would start, I think, the fastest 24 as far as qualifying speed. Within 1 or 2 laps, he would bring other cars on. It was kind of disguised that as one car dropped out, another one came on, but John was sharp enough to know we needed action. So you would have more cars come on. The trick to winning the 3 hour figure eight was always the last cars that made it onto the track were the slowest. So as a driver races 200, 300 laps on that figure eight and gets into a rhythm, the last 100 laps or so, or that last half hour or 45 minutes, last hour, was always the most tedious because you had the fastest cars on the track and the slowest cars. So it really messed up that driver's rhythm, and you really had to be on your toes to be able to win it.
Another rule that John Stiles gleefully eliminated. At other races, at other tracks, there is a flag. It is blue and it is yellow, or rather orange. What happened to that flag at the Indianapolis Speedrome?
It's called the move over flag, and really was never used. The unique thing about Speedrome, it's a 1/5 mile paved oval, has some banking to it, and you're always running side by side to begin with. So if you have a move over flag, there's nowhere to move over. And on the figure eight, obviously if you're slower, you're going to get passed anyway. So we eliminated that. One unique thing that I enjoyed working with John with, we were one of the few racetracks that did a weekly printed program. We called it the Pit Board, and it was distributed free. It was supported by advertising, but this was a benefit to the fans because they could be apprised of what was coming up, what happened in the past. The other thing it did, by the photos that we ran in it, it helped validate what those drivers did, and it was something obviously they could show their friends, their neighbors. Really became a good selling tool, a good promotional tool for the Speedrome.
Your job was not only the Indianapolis Speedrome, but also the American Speed Association to create heroes. Was what you learned at the Speedrome applicable to the American Speed Association when it was considered to be the nation's best short track racing organization?
Most certainly, especially in terms of how the media at the track was treated. In other words, at the Speedrome, I always try to make sure that the media we got out there as guests, and even our special guests as sponsors, were not only welcome, but that they had the information that they needed. And this certainly carried over into the American Speed Association, because so many places, so many towns that we went, and it was true here in Indianapolis. In Indianapolis, you have to remember that if you were a sports writer for the old Indianapolis News, Indianapolis Star, the only thing you knew about racing really was the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. When you got into the short track realm, which is a completely different animal, you knew very little about the competitors, knew very little about the track, very little about the cars. We tried our best to make sure that those people were informed, so if they were doing a driver interview on TV or if they were doing a story in print, that they at least had the background knowledge that they could kind of transmit that to not only to the motorsports fan, but to the casual race fan. The media here in Indianapolis was very gracious to the Speedrome. We were able to not only create a good local atmosphere for the Indianapolis Speedrome, but also national publicity. At that time, as you well know, there were probably easily 24 weekly motorsports publications. Of course, the Bible was National Speed Sport News. I had the privilege of working with them for many years. Same with Stock Car Racing Magazine. Those two publications for decades were the Bibles of the industry. Well, nationally, the Speedrome had its place with them through the USAC Midget Series, through our figure eight racing, which after you talk to promoters and sports and magazine editors and publication editors, they say, wow, you've got something that's really unique that draws spectators, that attracts spectators. You can have the best racing in the world, but if you don't draw spectators, nobody knows about it. So you had to make sure those people came through the gates. One of the best promotions we ran was a free ticket night to many little league organizations, bantam football leagues, church groups. John Stiles was gracious. We would print up a ticket coupon, and that was basically a free admission. Now, what the groups would do, they would charge $2 or $3, and they would keep 100% of those proceeds. But we knew that those fans that came to the racetrack, if you get in free to something, that means you've got extra dollars in your pocket. You're going to spend those on souvenirs, you're going to spend those on food at the concessions, and you're going to see some racing action and be entertained in a way that you've never been entertained before. So you're going to come back, and not only that, you're going to tell your friends about the Indianapolis Speedrome and the racing that was there. The Speedrome in the late 40s through the 50s and 60s was ideally located because you had Ford Motor Plant, you had Chrysler, you had International Harvester, you had a number of manufacturing facilities within hearing distance of the Speedrome. Well, a lot of those workers on a Friday night or Saturday night, they would come to the Speedrome because they drive past it every day. Western Electric also up toward the north side. They would drive past the Speedrome and say, hey, this it might be a cool place to take our buddies or some of our co-workers to the racetrack. And that helped build that fan base in the late 40s throughout the 50s that stayed with the Speedrome down through the years. Now the Speedrome is in this mix of attracting new generations to motorsports and the figure eight racing and the type racing that does go on there at the Indianapolis Speedrome.
Much of the early 21st century has been tough for American short tracks. We can think of many that have closed. The Indianapolis Speedrome faced a similar challenge in the 1980s. It would have been a situation that would have seen other tracks close down. But the combination of your conspiracy with John Stiles in the 1980s turned what would have been a problem into a major promotional opportunity.
Well, historically, the Indianapolis Speedrome is grandfathered in. In other words, it was built in the 40s when there were no zoning regulations and really there was no residential area around the Indianapolis Speedrome, then located on the far east side of Indianapolis. As the east side grew and as the Irvington community expanded, all of a sudden, and it wasn't all of a sudden, but here we were, a racetrack in a growing residential area. The noise from the stock cars and race cars that were at the Speedrome plus the PA to some of the new residents became irritating. And at that time there was an Irvington, I want to call it, it was an Irvington Civic League. That's not the exact name of it, but it was like a neighborhood association. But then in Indianapolis, these neighborhood associations and civic leagues had great clout with the government in Indianapolis. These were their people that they dealt with and got ideas from to improve neighborhoods. Well, all of a sudden it came, well, the Speedrome is too noisy, they need a noise ordinance, and actually they need to be out of business. They don't need to be existing. So between the noise ordinance and some of the things that were going on in City Hall was kind of against the Indianapolis Speedrome. This gave us a chance we developed through the late Phyllis Tunney, who, to me, I know we've had women involved in the racetrack from PR and other realms, but Phyllis Tunney indeed was the first lady of the Indianapolis Speedrome. She put together a Speedrome fan club, got it built up. We created through some cartoonists and just publicity that, hey, folks, you really need to pay attention to what's going on in City Hall because the Speedrome may not be here. We were a step ahead of the Irvington people in that we passed our own noise ordinance, decibel limit for race cars. Not only that, we did something that was unique. At 11 o'clock, no matter what racing action was going on the track, at 11 o'clock the PA went silent, which kind of affected what the spectators were hearing or what they were seeing, but it was a way of being good stewards to the neighborhood. And we had one meeting there in Irvington, and I recall it, in that a lot of the comments were anti-short track racing, not anti-racing, because you had the Indianapolis Motor Speedway on the west side. Indianapolis Motor Speedway became our strongest ally because they also are grandfathered. So between, with noise limits here at the Speedrome, some other things that were going on. And Doug Bowles, who's at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway as president now, Doug was very instrumental in making sure that the Indianapolis Speedrome would exist for a long time. Was very instrumental behind the scenes in keeping this going and finally being zoned where we need to be as a racetrack in the city of Indianapolis. Certainly that has added to the longevity of the racetrack, but there's a certain stigma down through the years, no matter how popular short track racing has been, that, oh, this interferes with neighborhoods and interferes. Well, no, it doesn't, because it helps draw people to your neighborhood, it draws people to businesses in the area, and it's certainly beneficial to the overall economy, no matter where that racetrack is located, especially if it's in a small community. You have communities like Salem and Winchester that have half-mile racetracks. Certainly when they have events, it is a boon to the economy.
Now, I can't ask you about the time that you were at a certain racetrack in Canada when a guy had a bottle of, and it went in a cup that just looked like that cup, didn't it?
We had some incidents when I was traveling with the American Speed Association, and that's another totally different story that has historical impact and emphasis to the state of Indiana. This was a group that would go to quarter-mile, half-mile racetracks and put on 300, 400 lap events. But we had some interesting, and I can't identify the tracks. We had one horde event at a short track where
I'm sorry, Al. The Canadian liquor laws statute of limitations have not told. You cannot tell that story.
No, but we had one where there was an illegal liquid used within the frame rails of a stock car that leaked out on race day onto the track. We dodged that bullet. In Canada, the sponsors of the two events up there were beer companies, and there was always the night before the race party, which they would throw on, but you always had then. Canada was the forerunner of the designated driver. You definitely had to have a designated driver because the provincial police were waiting at the end of the driveway to make sure that everybody could get back to the hotel or motel or headquarters in proper fashion. But that kind of goes along with it. The racetracks, short tracks are honestly like the Indianapolis Speedrome. They are fun places to be. Food prices are reasonable, admission cost is reasonable, and for an evening of entertainment for 2.5 or 3 hours, you're certainly going to be entertained, and you're going to see action, you're going to see good racing, and you're going to see a good product that you're going to want to go back and see more of.
Yes. I did hear.
Okay,
Thank you very, very
cool.
much.